Bountiful valley, way up high, fertile and green land of the sky. Stood with the Blue Ridge mountain range, link the autumn's lingering springs. Along the parkway, you take a drive, slope down the French Broad, take a dive, maybe enjoy a local brew. All that and built more too in Asheville.
Hello, folks. It's Wednesday at 10 o'clock, and if you hear Queen Bee and the Honey Lovers singing Asheville, you know it's time for Storyville. I'm Chuck Fink, your host, and you're listening to WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, 1037 on your dial, and globally at WPVMFM.org. Folks, I am excited to introduce to you a friend and a colleague, Tim Lowry. Audiences across the country enjoy Tim's mix of stories from American history with a variety of folk tales and personal narratives. This award-winning recording artist has performed on television and in hundreds of appearances nationwide. When he's not on the road, Tim makes his home in Summerville, South Carolina, where he often performs stories of Southern culture and history from the Sweet Tea Trails. And a little side note, isn't it great to have someone from Summerville on Storyville? I think so. He has over a dozen audio recordings to his credit. He's filmed several video recordings, and has most recently produced a 90-minute film version of his one-man show, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Currently, Tim is producing an online magazine titled The Whole Year Round. It's a monthly subscription series for the whole family. It includes video and audio recordings, articles, book reviews, games, puzzles, contests, and fabulous prizes. And folks, this is a review from the Connecticut Storytelling Festival, and it really speaks to Tim's talents. From the time he took to the stage, Tim Lowry claimed the full attention of his audience. They followed him wherever he was performing. They loved Tim's style, his humor, his material, and the man himself. And folks, here is the man himself, Tim Lowry. How you doing, Tim?
I am very well. You know why those folks in Connecticut were mesmerized. I was wearing a seersucker suit and I kept moving around, so they were cross-eyed looking at me on the stage, and being the only Southerner at their festival, they couldn't understand anything I was saying anyway.
You know, it's funny you say that, because as I'm reading this from Connecticut, I'm thinking, these Yankees are giving tribute to a good old Southern boy from Summerville, South Carolina. Ain't that something?
Well, you know, that was the home state of choice for Mr. Mark Twain. So I suppose that they got acclimated through his personality.
And I married a New Englander, and I got to tell you, they're special people. At least my wife is. So, Tim, how'd you get started? What influenced you to become a storyteller, or who influenced you to become a storyteller?
When I was thinking about that earlier today, I thought, well, you could say my Sunday school teacher. I can tell you in a very brief anecdote what kind of lady she was like. I was raised a Baptist, but she should have been a nun. If you got caught chewing gum during Sunday school, not only would you not chew gum in Sunday school, you probably would just never chew gum again the rest of your life. So she took Bible stories seriously, and consequently, all of her students took them seriously. And then I had a family friend who was a very dear friend, more like an aunt than just a friend. Our families were really close. And she was my high school drama teacher and was a great storytelling coach. And then I also had a great storytelling teacher in college. All three ladies. But I would have to say the seed for storytelling was planted mostly by my adopted grandfather. I had a good friend, and I'd ride my bicycle down to his farm all the time when we were boys growing up in southeastern Kentucky and play. And his granddaddy was a character. Just yesterday, I was taking a walk around the neighborhood with my wife, and someone had set out on the curb for someone else to take if they wanted it, a big trunk that had carvings of Chinese characters and mountains and things all over it. But it was pretty far gone. The lid was broken. It had legs on it, and there was a couple legs missing. And I said, that's the very kind of thing that Poppy would have had in the barn. There was so much stuff in his barn, you could hardly get a horse in there. You would be in the barn full of hard corn. And if you were down at his house playing, he might say, I want you boys to go out there to that trunk and scoop up a can of corn and feed the chickens for me. He said, it's an old Chinese trunk, come from the Ming dynasty. I got it during the war, got it from old Genghis Khan himself. You might find something buried down in that corn. I don't know. I've never looked to see what's in the bottom of it. And you'd think, is that true? I mean, I know Poppy was in the war. We had seen his medal he was a decorated veteran. And then as you started to leave the front porch, he'd say, now be careful, there's a black snake under there and he might get you. And so then you would hesitate, like, should I go? Should I not? And his wife would say, stop teasing those boys. And then you knew, oh, this is mostly a story. And you'd be okay. You'd go feed the chickens. But I always, as a child, admired his ability to take just the tiniest bit of something and just blow it up into something marvelous in our eyes.
So it's almost like you were born and bred to be a storyteller.
Sometimes people say that about musicians, particularly like really fabulous singing quartets and trios and things. And they'll say, really great singers, particularly singers that work together so well, are not taught, they're born. Mm-hmm. And I think that that may be true for storytellers as well. At least if they weren't born to it, they're born into a place where it's part of the natural way of doing things. And so they just kind of grow up with an intuition for it.
Wow. A couple of things, actually one really important one. Your adopted grandfather, you called him Poppy.
Uh-huh.
Well, I'm a grandfather.
We called him that because he was a forest ranger, and he was a big man. And so he could fill out a Smokey Bear costume with no padding. And every year at the Christmas parade, he stood in the back of a forestry pickup truck dressed as Smokey Bear and would wave to the boys and girls on the sidewalk in the Christmas parade. And at 4th of July time, you'd see Smokey Bear and you'd see him at the county fair and all. And so we got to calling him Poppy Bear, like Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear from the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. That's why we all called him Poppy.
Well, my granddaughter calls me Poppy, and I just found out I'm going to have a grandson come August. So I love the name Poppy, but for me, it just came from something that I thought a child could remember and say, like Poppy. So,
sure.
So yeah, your grandfather and this grandfather have something in common. Although I'm not a guy, and I don't fill out anything without padding.
We have several cousins, and so our children, my wife and I's children, were not the first in her side of the family to be born. And her older brother called us just days before his wife was to deliver their first child, and he's a very serious-minded man, and he said, I just thought I would have a conference call. And this was back when that was a lot of trouble. You had to call the operator and get that all set up. He said, with all the brothers and sisters who are going to be aunts and uncles, and we should decide together what the grandparents will be called by the grandchildren. We all just burst out laughing. We said, that's the prerogative of the firstborn grandchild. Whatever they do, that's what the rest of us will call them.
Exactly. Well, Tim, obviously you're very creative. When I was talking about in your introduction about the music you perform, the videos, the magazines, you're very creative. What inspires your creativity?
Somebody said to me once, and I don't remember who it was. It might have been in the context of a speech or something. They said that there's nothing more inspirational than seeing people do what they were born to do. And I think that It's very, very true. We often recognize that with the greats. For instance, yesterday, a friend of mine was visiting at a nearby playground here in the neighborhood, and their car battery died. And we tried to jump it and it wouldn't go. And so he was going to have to run to the store and get a new car battery. And his wife came and got him a second car. But they couldn't get the windows rolled up because it was electric and they had stuff in their car. And I said, I tell you what, I've been trying all day and I keep getting interrupted to listen to Beethoven. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stay here and put my earbuds in with my iPhone and listen to Beethoven and guard your car while you go and get the battery and the tools that you need. That's about the extent of my mechanical ability. I could listen to music and cheer you along. So Beethoven, you recognize it right away in people like Beethoven. You listen to Haydn, you think, wow. You listen to Mozart and you go, ooh. And then you hear Beethoven's 9 symphonies and you say, that man was born to define a symphony. But people are virtuosic at all kinds of things. A number of years ago, we had a tree trimming company come to our backyard. The trees sold our house to us. When the realtor showed us our home, we went out in the backyard and there are 9 huge mature shade trees. We don't even have a lot of grass in the backyard because of the shade trees. And we said, sold. That's what we want. I despise those neighborhoods where they build these big fancy houses, but before they start, they come in with a bulldozer and mow down the entire forest. I think you just destroyed the most valuable thing. But anyway, I digress. So we had a tree company come and trim the trees. And this really sharp young man, he said, let's play a little game. He had this big, long, plastic coated, like rubber coated cable with a weight on the end of it. And he said, to save us from having to climb all these trees, he said, we'll climb them to trim them out. But he said, any dead limb that's hanging, you just point to it and I'll lasso it down. And I mean, they were way up, 30, 40, 50 feet up. And you'd see this big tree limb dangling. And you think that's going to fall out and kill somebody. And I'd point one out and he would whirl that cord around and fling it way up in the sky. And it would wrap around that and he'd just yank it right down. He never missed. And I said, how in the world did you learn to do that? And he smiled and he said, you remember how many trees came down in 1989 when Hurricane Hugo, a Category 5 hurricane, hit the coast of South Carolina? I said, oh, yeah, I remember. He said, I had just taken this job. I was an apprentice 3 days in when that hurricane hit. He said, I learned to do this really fast. But it was so much fun to watch somebody do something that they were just born to do. Like you were made to be a lumberjack. There's no question about that.
And by the way, I teach classes on storytelling at OLLI, which is the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Asheville. There's 120 around the country.
Oh, yes.
And we're all old farts, to put it mildly. But I define storytelling. I don't know if you agree with this or not, and I have to clean it up a little bit for radio. I define it as BSing with an attitude.
I would say BS with sugar.
Well, let's try to make some
almost anything if you just sugar it up a little bit.
Well, let's see if we can't sweeten up the show with one of your stories. Can you share with us one of your stories?
Well, sometimes I tell audiences a story about a man that I met who had a good bit of influence on my professional life. That was not what he was setting out to do, but he was definitely one of those people who had discovered what he was born to do. Mm-hmm. I taught school for 5 years. And I had started out thinking that I wanted to be a professional performer and had a little crisis of identity and started teaching school. That was not an entirely bad idea, but after my 5th year, I was kind of miserable. I really didn't want to be a school teacher. So I think best when I'm driving. Consequently, in these stay-at-home pandemic times, I find it really hard to write stories because I do a lot of thinking on long drives. Me, the hum of the engine, and Beethoven get a lot done. But anyway, so I thought I'm going to take a long drive and think this out. What do I want to do? I have cousins that live in Atlanta, and I was living here, not in Somerville at the time. I was living in Charleston, our big sister city. And I thought, I'm going to drive to Atlanta and visit my cousins for a long weekend and drive back. That gives me a good 6 hours coming and going to think this out in the car. Well, on my way back from Atlanta, I was on the interstate and I thought, oh, this is so boring. Maybe I'm going to get off the interstate. And this was before you had a GPS on your cell phone and in your car and everywhere else. And so I checked a map at a rest area, and I saw that there was a highway that cut across the bottom third of South Carolina that would meander almost back to Charleston. And it was a country road, Highway 301. And I thought that'd be more interesting, and I'm kind of on this whole trip for the drive's sake anyway. So I'll take that route instead of going on the interstate. So I got off on Highway 301, and I did see a lot of interesting things. I saw a cow and a cow and a cow and a camel. And at first I thought, no, I did not see a camel. I saw an arthritic horse. That's what I saw. But I was driving at a good clip, so I'd gone by before I got a really good gander at it. But just beyond that spot, there was a little church with a gravel parking lot and place where you could turn around by the side of the road. And I thought, oh, it's a sign. Let us turn aside and see this thing which has come to pass. So I turned around and went back. And sure enough, my eyes did not deceive me. There was a dromedary camel standing behind 3 strands of barbed wire, chewing cud and looking at me as if to say, so? And that's when I noticed a sign posted up on the side of the road. It said, O'Kane's Wild Animal Park. There was a big arrow pointing up a gravel driveway. And then in smaller letters, it said parking in rear. I thought, well, I got to see this. So I pulled up this long gravel driveway. There was a brick ranch house, nothing unusual, and an extra big parking area off to the side in the back. So I parked, and I had no sooner turned off the engine of my car than this guy came rumbling along on a riding lawnmower, and hitched to the back, he had a small trailer, and thrown in that trailer was all kinds of what was obviously produce from the local supermarket that had not sold in several days. There was wilted lettuce and carrots that you could kind of bend double and junk like that. He turned off the engine on the riding mower and he said, you want to see my zoo? And I said, well, I saw your camel standing by the side of the road. And then I read the sign and I was just overcome with curiosity. He said, it'll cost you $4. I said, okay. So I had $4 in my wallet, which is unusual because I use a card for about everything. I gave him the $4 and he said, just climb on behind me. Just sort of stand on the hitch of this riding mower. And he said, I'll give you a driving tour of my zoo. He started up that riding mower and we rumbled off and we went beyond the parking area to a big grassy field. And he turned off the engine again. He said, this here's my prairie dog town. Just sit and watch for a minute. And all of a sudden, sure enough, genuine bona fide prairie dog came popping up out of a hole, and another one popped up over here. And I started counting. There must have been 30 or 40 of the things popping up all over the place. And he told me all about prairie dogs. And I said, that's kind of a Western thing. How in the world did you get prairie dogs in South Carolina? And he said, son, did you go to school? I said, yeah. He said, you didn't learn very much. He said, you get a male prairie dog and a female prairie dog, dig a hole, throw them in there and spring. You got prairie dog town. You got prairie dogs everywhere. So then he took off again on the riding mower. He said, reach around behind you into that trailer and get yourself a carrot. I'll let you feed the ostrich. We pulled up to a big chain link fence and there's this huge bird standing behind the fence. And he said, just reach that carrot up. He said, he'll just grab it out of your hand. Now, you would think that an ostrich would swallow a carrot lengthwise with that big, long, narrow neck. I'm not lying to you. That thing swallowed that carrot sideways. It looked like it had gulped a pencil. You could watch the outline of that carrot go all the way down that thing's throat. We took off again, drove past a little enclosure where he had a family of raccoons living in a hollow log. And we pulled up to a shed. It was shaped like a barn, but it's not a real barn. It's just like one of those things that you buy prefab from the hardware place and you put your lawnmower and bicycles and stuff in it. He hops off the riding mower and he starts working the combination on this great big lock. And he says, this here's my snake house. just sounded nasty. And it pretty much was. I thought, well, this won't be too bad. You know, it'll be like some snakes in some fish tanks like you see at the pet store. Oh, no, no. When he swung those doors open, he had it all painted up like a jungle scene on all the walls, had a little fountain water feature in the corner and tropical plants everywhere, and big old snakes just crawling around in there. I said, I'm not going in there. He said, they won't hurt you. I said, I know, because I'm not going in there. And then so he closed that up and he said, all right. He said, if you don't want to see the snakes, that's fine. He said, but when we come to the alligator pit, I'm not taking no for an answer. I thought, oh, great. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. We went and saw the camel and saw a llama. He had a family of wallabies. Those are the little kangaroos. And then we got to the alligator pit. He had a pond with an island in the middle, big 8-foot chain link fence around with barbed wire on the top like you would see at a prison. He unlocks another gate and swings it open. He says, it's still early. He said, and so the air's not real warm. Their blood's running cold. He said, they're moving slow. Come on in and I'll show you. I got 10 gators in here. So I gingerly followed him in, and I can see a gator on an island in the pond, and I can see a couple gators on the far bank, and I start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I couldn't find the 10th gator. I counted again and again. He said, oh, you're worried. He said, you think one might sneak up behind you. He said, no. He said, that ain't going to happen. He said, number 10 is a big old mama, and she's done hatched a clutch of eggs, and she's got them in a den dug back in the bank here. And then he announced very proudly, like P.T. Barnum at the circus, he said, if you want to see a mama alligator and her live babies, all you have to do is grab a hold of this willow branch right here and sort of swing down and look back into that hole she's dug in the mud bank. And when she sees you, she'll come out. When all the babies will be riding on her back. And then when you see her, you need to scramble up pretty quick. I did it. It was like I was outside of my body watching myself do something stupid. So I swung down, and sure enough, this big old she-gator comes crawling out. You could see the babies on her back, and she starts to bellow. She's going, and I scrambled back up the bank. I said, I just got my entire $4 worth. That was a great tour, but I think I'm done. So he rode me on the ride mower back to my car. And before I left, I said, one question. And he said, yes. I said, how in the world did you get such a menagerie of exotic animals in the country out? We were in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And he took me by the shoulders and looked me dead in the eye. And he said, son, I'm going to tell you something. He said, when I was your age, he said, even before that, when I was in high school, he said, I always would say I wanted to be a zoologist. But my daddy said, there ain't no money in that. You ain't going to be no zoologist. And he said, I wasn't a strong enough personality to tell my daddy, no, that's not what I really wanted to do. He said, so I did not go to college. He said, I finished high school and I inherited my daddy's construction business, and I worked construction for 30 years and I hated it. But I saved all my money. And when I retired, I bought myself a zoo. He went on to tell me that all the local schools would bring their kids there on field trips, and he would do animal demonstrations. And sometimes he'd take some of the safer animals to schools and do a lecture series. And then he says, don't wait 30 years to do what you really want to do. And when I got home, I wrote a letter of resignation to my principal and told him that I was ready to move on to other things, and called my parents and said, I'm going to become a professional storyteller, and and never looked back.
And that's how it all began. Wow. By the way, when you're telling that story, I can't help but to let you know, I'm thinking that popular Netflix series that came out last year, Tiger King. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's sure.
Well, I've heard of that, but I live very near Charleston, South Carolina, and I understand that they have feature attractions from Myrtle Beach on that series. And I live just close enough to Charleston. There's enough snobbery running through my veins. I can't be party to that. So I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
Well, I got to tell you, he was really bizarre, and I think now he's still in jail. But your friend that you met that owned that zoo was inspirational. He was inspirational to you, inspirational
was.
to the kids. It's really
A child asked me one time when I was performing at an elementary school somewhere in South Carolina, but it wasn't Orangeburg. I don't remember where I was. And they said, how did you become a storyteller? And I said, well, here's a story that you boys and girls will enjoy that would help answer that question. And I told them about O'Kane's Wild Animal Park. And I noticed that the teacher who was sitting with the children got up from her chair and went to the computer and tap, 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 and printed something out while I was talking. And when we were done, she met me at the door when I was leaving the classroom, and she said, I printed you something. She said, I grew up in Orangeburg. And she said, I knew him well. She said, that is all true. We would go to his farm and see the animals, and he would bring animals to school. And she said, he died recently, and this is a copy of his obituary. I thought you would be interested to read it.
Oh, wow. So you stories have a beginning, an arc, a middle, and an end, and that is the end of that story.
And it sure is. Yeah, I don't know what happened to all those animals, because she said that nobody in the family was really interested to keep all that going. They had other careers and other things they wanted to do. And so they were looking for places that could pick up animals. And I don't know a whole lot about exotic animal husbandry, but everything was neat as a pin, clean as a whistle. Everybody looked very well cared for. So I'm assuming that because of what he said to me, he would never expect his children to do that if that's not what they wanted to do. So I'm sure they all went to good homes somewhere.
Well, you're telling a story about overcoming your fear of gators. And I want to now apply that to stories themselves. Are there any stories that you're kind of afraid to tell?
I can't think of any that I would be afraid to tell. I think if I have a fear as a storyteller, I think most performers would say this if you pin them down. I'm scared to death to disappoint people. There's nothing worse than wasted time. And when people come to see a show, they don't want their time wasted. Time is very valuable. It's an extremely limited resource. So I always want to do my very best to hit the mark. So it's not so much that I'm afraid to tell the story. I'm afraid I might miss and tell the wrong story for a particular audience or for a particular occasion.
I understand that. So you're more afraid of disappointing than you are of telling any particular type of story or story itself. That's interesting because, as you said, you really have to match your stories to your audience. And sometimes you don't know who your audience is. I'll never forget, about 2 years ago, I'm telling a story that I'm going to be telling in a couple of weeks too, about creating these men's groups that I founded at Ollie. And when I first told it, there was a woman in the front row. I don't know if you know David Joe Miller, but he produced the show. And so I'm about to tell the story. I look down and there's a woman with two baby brand new kittens. I guess baby kittens is kind of redundant, but they were brand new and they're in a box. And I'm here to tell this story about men's groups. And I see these little kittens. And I was kind of afraid to say some stuff. And actually, there was a guy who introduced himself at the first meeting saying, I'm Gene and I kill baby seals for a living. What? And then he fessed up. He said, well, actually, I work for a major oil company. And this was the time during the BP oil spill. And he said, if you compare working for an oil company as an engineer versus killing baby seals, maybe baby seals today garners a little bit more positive reaction than working for an oil company. So we all have to beware of our audience because I'm telling that same story at Ollie, and there's a word that I really have to be careful using. It's one of Carlin's 7 dirty words, but it's so apropos to the story, and I have to work through that. Do I clean it up a little? And I probably will. But enough about me. Let's get back to you, Tim. How do you mentally posture yourself? What's the difference in your posture when you tell a personal narrative, a personal story, compared to like a folk tale or a literary classic? How do you change your posture?
I don't think there's a whole lot of change. You really have to, any story that you're going to tell well, you have to make your own. And so it might be that it takes longer for that to happen for one story as opposed to another. A personal narrative, in many respects, is the easiest to make your own because you lived it, you experienced that. For me, the emotions of a personal experience story are not so, you don't feel like you're ginning anything up because you can remember that your physical makeup, your body will remember how you felt and how you were standing at that time and in that place. Stories of history, you have to really begin to think like that subject did in that time and that place. And so that might take a little longer to get into that mental spot where you're feeling what they're feeling. But it can be done. And it can, once they're your good friend, so to speak, a story from American history or world history, it becomes your own. I remember it's been, 3, 4, 5 years ago now. I was going to a storytelling performance in Ozark, Alabama. And that was going to take me on a long country road. The best things happen on long country roads. So I was driving along and I went, I saw a sign for Plains, Georgia, and the Jimmy Carter Library. And very near that, and that was extremely interesting to me. But then President Carter, God bless him, got trumped because the next sign that I saw was for Andersonville prison camp from the Civil War. And it is in such a far remote, I mean, it was a prison camp. They wanted a far remote place so nobody could escape. You would never go there. You're on your way to something else if you stumble upon Anderson prison camp. And I tell a series of stories about the Civil War heroine, Clara Barton, and her work as a Civil War nurse and later her founding of the American Red Cross. She was instrumental in documenting much of the suffering that went on at Andersonville prison camp. She and a small band of volunteers marked all of the graves at Andersonville prison camp. So that federal cemetery there is directly her work. And so after I had finished my job in Ozark, I asked my hostess, I said, I only brought one white shirt to wear with my suit for my show. I said, after the show tonight, can we launder this shirt and press it? Because tomorrow I'm going to visit Andersonville prison camp. And she said, I think I understand what you're saying. You want to be dressed nice when you visit there. I said, yeah, I do. So I went, and it's just a big field. The camp itself there's not even a ruin because the walls were made of wooden logs. They're long gone. So there's just an outline with posts of where the camp was laid out and a field of wildflowers. And because I know those stories and know what happened there and spent years telling those stories and becoming very acquainted with them, the further I walked around the perimeter of that great big field of wildflowers, the more emotional I became. And I got to a certain point and there was a plaque about some of the terrible things that those prisoners suffered. And there was a lady standing there reading that plaque. And she turned around and looked at me and just very casually, just almost like a joke. And she didn't mean to be flippant. She really didn't. But she didn't have all that history like I had. And she said, who wouldn't want to be a Yankee in this prison? And the tears just spilled out over my cheeks. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. And I said, these men were my friends. And I just turned around and walked away. And I'm sure to this very day, she says, I met one of those crazy Southern reenactor people.
Well, but
are
you a
I
reenactor?
Really felt like I knew them, you know?
Are you a reenactor? Have you done it?
No.
Okay.
No,
well,
I love stories of American history, but I like sleeping in a nice warm bed and eating restaurant food. So
Well, Tim, I have to satisfy the FCC right now by saying you're listening to WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, 1037 on your dial, and globally at WPVMFM.org. Now, Tim, I have to ask you to tell a special story. I've heard this story, and especially now with all that's going on in this world, you tell a story about you're working as a young man in Charleston and coming upon a church service. Can you share that story with our audience today?
Sure. And after I tell you, remind me to tell you this, like the story after the story.
Great.
So I had up and decided that I was going to become a professional storyteller. I quit my job as a school teacher, called my mom and dad and said, I quit my job and I'm going to become a professional storyteller. And my mom said, would you like fries with that? I said, it's really what I want to do. She said, all right. Well, if I was going to be a professional storyteller, I needed to have a job and be in an atmosphere where I was closely linked to the local folk culture. And I lived in Charleston, South Carolina, which has a marvelous history and a very deeply rooted folk culture. So I thought, well, perfect. So I signed on to be a carriage driver in the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina, where history lives, over 5,000 homes and public buildings on the National Register of Historic Places. Sorry, once a tour guide, always a tour guide. And I drove carriages, which meant that I was dressed in a polyester version of a Confederate uniform, red sash, because that's what the cavalry wore, and we were working with horses, and drove these big Surrey wagons that would hold 16 tourists, great big draft horse. And you would stand at the wrong end of that horse, so to speak, with a big buggy whip and point out to all the visiting Yankees, this is this, and that is that, and this is this. And most of the stuff you're saying ain't even true. So you get a good a bit of experience at coloring things up and becoming a professional storyteller. And I was busy doing that. And the man who ran the particular carriage company that I worked for was a proud graduate of the Citadel Military College of South Carolina. And he liked to participate in a little bit of hazing. So as you were coming along, there were these informal initiations that you probably weren't aware you were going to have to go through. And the first time you did a tour all by yourself, you were going to drive the horse and give all the information. He would sneakily feed your horse bananas so that it had horrid gas. And as you're rolling down the streets, your horse is punctuating your sentences as you go along. And this is what I had left a secure job with benefits to do. And I was working my way up the folklore ladder, I suppose, driving carriages in Charleston, South Carolina. I was as poor as Job's turkey. I had hawked my high school class ring. I hawked my college class ring. I lived on cereal for major meals. I sold my car and had a bicycle, and I would ride my bicycle back and forth to work. I lived in a tiny little efficiency apartment. I often tell people, I say my apartment was very tiny. It was like being in the very lowest cabin on a cruise ship. It was so small I could sit on the toilet and do dishes at the same time. But I was determined to stick it out and make it as a storyteller. There was no way I was going to give up. Well, one summer evening, I had driven carriages all day, and then we'd have to stay and bathe the horses and make sure they were fed and put them in their stalls. So by the time I got on my bicycle to head up from the carriage companies are all located on Market Street. And there's a side street called Anson. My apartment was way up Anson Street. So when I started up Anson Street on my bicycle, it was just the edge of dark, or maybe right after dark. And at the top of Anson Street, there is a church called St.Johns Episcopal. I shall never forget. It was a Thursday night. I don't know if they do now, but at that time they did not have air conditioning in their church. And being a hot summer night, they had all the windows wide open, the shutters up, and you could see the lights from inside the church glowing out through the windows. And because everything was opened up, you could readily hear what was going on inside. And the congregation was singing all kinds of old hymns that I grew up a preacher's kid in the mountains of Kentucky. So there were all these old hymns being sung that I was very familiar with. Victory in Jesus, On Jordan's Stormy Banks, and of course, Amazing Grace. And I stopped my bicycle and stood there on the sidewalk listening and was completely overcome with homesickness. Not so much that I just wanted to go see my family, but homesick for a different time and a different place, homesick for my childhood. And I was just standing there listening, and I felt a presence behind me. And I turned around, and there was a lady standing behind me, a Black lady. And given the travesty of slavery, I doubt that she could trace her family history many, many generations back, because so many African-American families' history was lost due to travesty of slavery. But if we could trace her family tree back far, far, far away, I'm convinced that she would have descended from Nubian royalty. She carried herself like a queen, and she was dressed appropriately. She was wearing a purple hat, a purple silk blouse, purple jacket, purple skirt, purple pantyhose, purple shoes, and she had a little boy standing next to her dressed in orange. I figured he was adopted. And she said, I can see that you're moved. Why don't you come in and praise the Lord with us? And I started immediately making excuses. I said, oh, no, ma'am. I've been driving horses all day. I look terrible. I smell worse. I'm not at all dressed appropriately for a church service, but I really enjoyed listening to that singing. She said, I can see that you need this, and God don't care what you look like as long as you show up. Now, I want you to come in. And she stepped behind me and just kind of ushered me toward the door. Well, suffice it to say, she was enough of a presence that when she got behind you and ushered you toward the door, there was no turning around and going back. So I stepped across the threshold of St. John's Reformed Episcopal Church, which was built just a couple decades after the Civil War, as the tour guide manual would tell you, for, quote, free people of color. And far too late, I realized I'm still dressed in my Confederate uniform. The singing stopped. And the pastor stood up in a very dignified tone. He said, we have a visitor. And the whole congregation turned to look at me coming through the door. And he asked me to introduce myself. So I said my name was Tim, and I was a carriage driver, and heard their singing, and it reminded me of my childhood. And I said, and this lady invited me to come in. He said, that's just fine. That's just fine. Just sit with your new friend. You're most welcome here. So I sat with the purple lady and her orange boy. And then there was more singing. There was a women's chorus, and then there was a men's chorus. There was a soloist sang. And then they had a little ceremony called a Sunday school march. And the organist played Onward Christian Soldiers, classic Christian march song, and kids started sliding out of the pews with money, and they were putting money in an offering plate that was on the table up front. Well, I wanted to do my part, so I reached into my pocket and got out a $5 bill from my carriage driving tips and handed it to the little boy in orange. And he slid out of the pew and started forward. And when he started forward, his mother reached up and grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around, and she said, where'd you get that money? And he hooked a thumb, said, the white boy gave it to me. And there was no question which white boy he was talking about. So he went forward and put the money in the bowl up front. And after the Sunday school march, everybody settled back into their seats, and it was time for the sermon. Now, my dad is a Baptist preacher, retired. He filled the pulpit for 50 years. So I thought I knew a thing or two about preaching. I had never in my life heard preaching like that. First, there was a reading of the text, and the pastor said, Jesus was walking upon the road. He did that in standard English, and then he switched and he read the rest of the text in the Gullah language. Now, Gullah is the seacoast island language, a Creole language that was developed by enslaved Africans. It's a mixture of idiom, some of it archaic English idiom, some of it African idiom, some words directly from tribal languages in Africa, some archaic English words. Creole is just a mix. It's best if you can kind of train your ear with something familiar. So the context of this story is church. The Lord's Prayer in Gullah goes, we papa up there in the heaven, all the way holy be thy precious righteous name. We want everything down here on the earth same like they be up there in the heaven. Give we now the daylight bread we need, Yah, this day and most every day, and forgive we for all the bad thing we done do, because we don't forgive all them what do by the we. Don't let us have hard tests when Satan try we. Let them be easy. You the holy king, big boss man over all of we. And everything gonna be like you say gonna be, and we give you praise forever and ever. Amen. So he read the text in this Creole language, and he said, Jesus been pon top the road there. And there been all kind of people say they're gonna go with the Lord. There been a man say he gonna follow the Lord, but his pa been dead. So he got to go home and bury a pa. And Jesus say, you let the dead pa lay in the graveyard. You come with me now. And he say, he ain't going to go. Another man say, he going to go with the Lord, but he got to go home and say, hey, oh, Bubba, to all the family. And Jesus say, you ain't got time for say, hey, oh, Bubba, to all the family. You got to come with me now. And then he say, he ain't going to go. There been all kind of people they say they're going to go with Jesus on top of the road, and then they all won't go. And Jesus, he just shake his head and say, Them what put their hand to the plow and cast their back to the big house, they ain't fit for work in my field. And then he set the Bible to the side and he said, ladies and gentlemen, this is a story about Jesus traveling on the road. Now I want you to turn to the people on your left and say, get on the road. So we all turned to the left, and then everybody laughed, because if the whole congregation turns left, you're talking to the next person's the back of their head. But we all said, get on the road. He said, now turn to the people on your right and say, I said, get on the road. So we all turned and said, I said, get on the road. And then he launched into a sermon that had more highs and lows than I had ever heard come from a preacher. I was glad I was a stranger in that place, because he stopped just short of naming names. He said, Jesus wants you to follow him on the road. Do not turn off. Do not take an exit. Do not fall in the ditch. Do not get distracted. Stay on the road. And the congregation would repeat, stay on the road. Get on the road. Get on the road. He said, you women come to me and you say, preacher, something wrong. There's just something wrong, and I need some medical attention. I can't have any children. He said, we pray and God perform a miracle. And next thing I know, you got 5 children. Ain't none of them in Sunday school. You say, I can't bring them to Sunday school. I got 1 still in diapers and 2 that are allergic to everything. And I don't know why. He said, get those children on the road to the church and the Sunday school. Stay on the road. And everybody would yell, stay on the road. And I noticed that the organist who had played for all of that singing had not left the organ bench when it was sermon time. She stayed on the organ bench. And now I realized that she was there to punctuate the preacher's sentences. She started going, it was like a Cincinnati Reds baseball game. And this is building bigger and bigger. He said, and you men. And then the organist goes, dun, 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 dun. He said, you men come to me and you say, preacher, I got me a job, but I'm going to lose it because I don't have a car. I don't have a way to get to work. He said, we take up a collection and buy you a car. Next thing I know, you ain't in church. I say, how come you weren't in church on Sunday? I got to stay home and wash my car. Get that car on the road to the church and the Sunday school. Get on the road. Get on the road. And this is building higher and higher. And I think, where is this going? And then finally, at the climax of the sermon, he said, you may be down. You may be weary. You may think, I can't do it. I can't follow the Lord. I can't stay on the road. I'm going to fall off. He said, that ain't going to happen to you. That ain't going to happen to you. God would never let you stay on the road all by yourself. You're never alone. You are never alone. And it was like the whole world froze for me right at that minute, because at that time, I felt so terribly alone. He said, God is always with you. He sends the Holy Spirit. He said, now, the Gullah in this translation of the Bible was translated directly from the Greek. And that's true. The American Bible Society sponsored a translation of the New Testament, the good news about Jesus Christ, where Luke set them down, from the Greek. He said, now, the Greek word for Holy Spirit is paraclete. He said, let me put that down where you live. He said, he is your paraclete. He is your parachute. He will catch you if you fall. He is your parasol. He will shelter you in a time of storm. He is your paralegal. He will help you through a time of trial. He is your paratrooper. He will still the enemy and the avenger. He is your paramedic. He will save your sin-sick soul. And the organist went, do-do-do-do-do. I never heard that much shouting in a church unless somebody had a snake. It was marvelous. And then things came down and they practiced an old Gullah tradition. A sermon might be given long time back in plantation days by a man who felt the call to preach, but he didn't have the opportunity for any kind of formal education. He probably couldn't even read and write. So not being trained formally as an orator, he might get to a point and then not know exactly how to finish. And the congregation didn't want him to suffer embarrassment about that. So if they saw that he had kind of run out of things to say, they would practice a tradition called singing him down. And the congregation would just start to sing, and they would begin to sing so loudly that you couldn't continue speaking. And then you were excused from the pulpit and you could sit down. Now, this preacher could read and write just fine. I mean, he had a seminary degree, but they practiced that old tradition, at least for this service. And somebody started to sing, I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, a traveling through this world of woe. Now, Black people sing that song. It's very much a song they've adopted in their church culture in many places. But actually, that's an Appalachian folk song. I knew that song from my childhood growing up in the hills of Kentucky. And as the congregation began to join in singing, everybody stood up and we all filed out onto the sidewalk outside, and that was the end of the church service. And the lady dressed in purple came over to thank me for coming in and to give me a hug. It would be most correct to say she surrounded me completely. And when I was in her embrace, she whispered in my ear and she said, honey, if you miss your mama, you just come here to St. John's, because here you is family.
Oh my goodness. That we all need, human beings need to have an experience like you just described. Imagine what the world would be if we all got outside of our own comfort zones and visited some different culture and learned about it. My wife was a professor at the University of Cincinnati, speaking of the Reds, and she used to teach a concept called the contact hypothesis. And what it says is that you can harbor prejudice against a group because they're different. But once you have contact with a person from that group, that prejudice kind of goes away. And what you just described, Tim, is something that this world needs now. We need to eliminate our prejudice and look at people as human beings and what we can learn and gain from that experience. And the story you just told, Tim, encaptured all of that. Plus one important thing. I'm from Cincinnati. I lived there for about 56 years, except for college, and then moving here to Asheville in retirement. And I was a lifelong, very frustrated Reds fan. But I have to admit, I'm a late bloomer. I had to leave college after my sophomore year, and I was inspired to go back by my wife. And it was 1991. And the university is called the Union Institute. It's a place for non-traditional students to finish their degrees, which is what I did. But we would be in a classroom and we could hear the World Series from Riverfront Stadium at the time. Oh. The Reds playing. So my frustration finally ended in 1991. So Tim, we just have about 5 minutes left, but you're doing a lot because of the pandemic. I would imagine you're doing some shows on Zoom. Is that correct?
Here and there, storytelling festivals across the country have been working hard to present live storytelling in creative ways. And so later this spring, I have some shows coming up, and I'll post information about those on my website if anybody's interested in tuning in, not just to hear me, but the nice thing about a storytelling festival is it's like Morrison's cafeteria. There's more stuff than would be good for you to take, and you can pick and choose all the different things that might be of interest to you. I have been working mostly on a book, and part of that work is my new online magazine. So I've been doing some recordings for that as well. That's what keeps me busy most of the time. But before we run out of time, I just want to tell you very briefly the story after the story. With my story, Stay on the Road. When I developed that story, it was the first story that I told in front of a big audience. I told that story a number of years ago now at the National Storytelling Festival, and it very much resonated with the audience. And after that, Charleston, South Carolina suffered the Mother Emanuel AME massacre. And it was not the same church, but you could throw a stone from Mother Emanuel to St. John's Reformed Episcopal, where I visited. They're just less than a city block away. You can see one church from the other. And I had no idea when I started touring the country as a professional storyteller after the National Festival that year. Everywhere I would go, festival directors would say, you're free to tell any story that you want that you think the audience would enjoy, but at some point in the weekend, may we announce that you will tell Stay on the Road. And I began to realize that all across this country, Kansas, California, Utah, Alabama, people wanted so to say, we love you, we with you, we care about you, we're grieving with you, we're hopeful for you, we're praying for you, we're standing with you in Charleston, South Carolina. And this story gave them a way that they could do that, even though it wasn't the story of Mother Emanuel AME. And I think that is what I like about storytelling more than anything else, is that it is an excellent way to take care of each other. It's an excellent way to be a good neighbor. And that's why I'm a storyteller.
Oh, and I say this on several shows, but I got into storytelling in 2012, and I did some stand-up and I did some acting. And both of those fields are very competitive, and there's not a lot of support from within. Storytelling is so different because people are kind, people tend to be generous in terms of the human condition, and it's so different. Now, Tim, you, in telling what you just did, you mentioned several things that you have going on, some shows. You mentioned earlier DVDs, the magazine. If people want to find out more information about any of those things and about you, how can they get a hold of you? Your website, or are there other ways as well?
My website is probably the most efficient way to shout at me. So if you know my name, you know my website, storytellertimlowry.com. Lowry is spelled Lowry. There are ERY Lowrys, but my family did not buy the vowel. So we're just Lowry. Storytellertimlowry.com.
Excellent, excellent. You already mentioned what you have on the horizon. Is there anything else that you have scheduled coming up?
I'm going to do some ghost stories soon from a historic graveyard. Those will be for a storytelling festival. And then after that, they'll probably be available on my website or my YouTube channel, but you could find information about it from my website. Because we're in this time where we're doing a whole lot by video, I've been trying to think of ways that we could really take advantage of that. And I thought, ooh, why not tell stories about dead people while I'm sitting on their tombstones? That sounds like something that would be a lot of fun. So that's what I'm up to. We call the local police because we film at night. We call the local police and say, if you see a bunch of equipment and people kind of whooping it up in the graveyard, it's okay. It's on purpose. The church knows we're there.
Well, Tim, this has been a delightful hour. I'm so glad you were able to come to Storyville all the way from Somerville. And again, just thank you so much for your warmth, your intelligence, your sensitivity, and your caring, not to mention all your great stories. So thank you very much, Tim.
My great pleasure. Talking to another human being is always a tonic. Thank you.
Goodbye. And everybody, you've been listening to Storyville on WPVM FM 1037 on your dial. Goodbye, Tim. Goodbye, everybody.